Amazing. So, hello everyone. Thank you so much for being here this morning. The fact that you are here on this Saturday morning of a bank holiday is not lost on me, so appreciate that. My name is Ellie. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge, where I research the sort of intersections between horror cinema and folklore. And I do sort of less these sort of direct adaptations of fairy tale and folklore narratives, and more things like the style of horror cinema and how it's like fairy tales in its sort of use of themes of revenge and transformation, because it's violent and sexual and vibrant, and colorful and memorable and repetitive. And I also argue things like that horror cinema has a social function similar to folklore in managing cultural anxieties and collective sort of social issues and things like that. And I read sort of the communities that spring up around horror as folk groups. I read them through theories of folk groups to sort of argue that horror spectatorship has an important role for people's identities in a way that's very similar to folklore. And if all of that seems kind of far removed from the topic of analog horror, I hope that by the end of the presentation, it will be a little bit clearer some of the similarities between the subgenre and folklore. And a small content warning, there will be a very brief mention of suicide in this talk towards the end. Okay, so despite all of the similarities between folklore and analog horror that I've mentioned, I'm not really able in my work to fully designate horror cinema as folklore, because really folklore is unofficial, informal, popular culture. It's usually circulated between group members for free, and for the benefit of the group, whereas horror cinema is obviously a commercial product, it's mass media, it's passed down by professionals who are strangers, and it's usually circulated for a fee, and it's caught up in a lot of different sort of industries, including marketing, distribution, things like that. So it's not usually possible to fully call horror cinema folklore, but analog horror represents some really important exceptions to that. And it's one format, one type of horror cinema that I think you actually can argue is folklore. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Before I get into all of that theoretical stuff, though, what is analog horror? Really briefly, analog horror is a type of horror cinema that sort of developed on social media, mostly YouTube, but sometimes also TikTok and Instagram Reels. And it's an amateur horror cinema circulated for free on these social media platforms. And the name analog horror comes from the characteristic style of the genre, which replicates sort of VHS analog tape formats, including sort of defects like snow, grain, noise, audio distortion, and a VHS format of 4:3 a lot of the time as well. And because of that taped aesthetic, a lot of the time analog horror is presented through formats such as TV documentaries, broadcast hijackings, children's television shows, weather reports, that sort of thing. And all of that lends the genre a sort of a very uncanny sense of nostalgia. Even for people who didn't grow up with analog media, there's something very nostalgic about it, which makes it sort of all the more effective when these elements are rendered sinister. And a lot of the time there's sort of a cosmic or supernatural threat involved in the plots of analog horror, as well as a recurring suggestion that the media itself is being influenced by malicious forces, and it might be directly harmful for the spectator to view. And so there's a lot of sort of Lovecraftian themes that emerge across the narratives of an analog horror series, although the plots are quite cryptic and they often need a lot of sort of deciphering, which fans do sort of collectively on YouTube in comments and in response videos, but also in also sort of like on Reddit and Discord and sort of secondary fan spaces like that. Anything I haven't Yeah, that's kind of the basics of analog horror, basically, I think, yes. And important to point out that it's usually made by one person as opposed to a team of people. And these filmmakers self-describe as creators instead of directors. So it's separated from mainstream filmmaking in that way. And a lot of the time, these videos are made without any sort of film equipment. Or cast or crew or even locations. A lot of the time they're made using stock footage and sort of text generating software, things like Blender and Photoshop as well. And the most popular format for analog horror is usually a web series. These can span many years, and audiences try to decipher the narratives of these web series together. A lot of the time, or at least some of the time, it seems apparent that creators haven't got an intended overarching narrative at the start of a series, and it will kind of develop gradually, based to various degrees on the reception of the audience. So a lot of these series would have started as standalone episodes, and then based on the positive reaction of audiences, they would have been expanded into series. And so some sort of famous ones continuing to this day are Local 58, the Mandela Catalogue, and Kane Parsons' versions of the Backrooms. And the sort of primary the priority of analog horror is not really so much on narrative, even though they do become quite convoluted narratives and quite cryptic. The priority is on effect, and the effect of these films can be really deeply eerie, unsettling, and uncanny. And not only because they are based on social media, so sort of people can stumble upon them accidentally, you tend to watch them out of order, and with a lack of context that really enhances their reality effect. So they're always presented as true, as sort of a type of found footage, presented without any context, as a series of sort of mysterious tapes that the audience has to sort of decipher themselves. So video games have been really important to analog horror as well. Most of the time it's a web series on YouTube, but games such as Five Nights at Freddy's have been key in the development of the analog horror aesthetic. And then we also have sort of spin-off games such as Maple County included here, which are fan-made media, sort of done in tribute to a series, in this case, the Mandela Catalogue. And a lot of the time, the success of certain series can be partly due to the popularity of spin-off games like this. And a lot of the time, these fan games are produced also independently and for free. But to sort of understand the folkloric dynamics of analog horror, we have to go back to the really early days of the internet. And to me, what is one of the most fascinating aspects of digital folklore, and that's creepypastas. And to give a really brief summary for anyone who is not familiar with creepypastas, it's a type of gothic or horror-based online storytelling, the etymology of which is copy pasta. So that would have been a block of text that would have been copy and pasted across various websites. And creepypasta kind of became the natural descriptor for versions of copypastas that draw on the disturbing, monstrous, strange, grotesque, and or unknown, while invoking the thematic and structural qualities of legendary narratives. So this reference to the legendary genre of folklore describes a type of folklore that involves belief. So even if the audience doesn't necessarily believe the stories as true, there's at least a capacity for belief or an element of belief. Legends are a conversation around belief. So creepypastas are specifically affiliated with urban legends or contemporary legends, and they're always presented as true. And they're also presented anonymously or partially anonymously through pseudonyms online, and because they get copy and pasted without sort of crediting. And in a similar way to a lot of urban legends, which begin with a veracity claim, such as, this really happened to my cousin's friend, or I heard this happen to my hairdresser in a parking lot in Boston. A lot of creepypastas would open with a veracity claim of why the story is true or how the person came to experience it. So for instance, this is one of the earliest creepypastas. It's a website by a person called Ted the Caver. The creepypasta is called Ted the Caver. It was a standalone website in which Ted blogged about his ongoing adventures in Mystery Cave and this mysterious sounds, breezes, and hieroglyphs he discovered there. And the blog was updated intermittently until Ted decided once and for all to bring a gun to Mystery Cave after experiencing nightmares and hallucinations, after which he promptly disappears, and we never get another update from Ted, leaving his audience to sort of speculate on his demise. So this aspect of veracity, or belief in which the legend is presented as true, is now formalized in creepypasta spaces. So the most famous stories are collected on the creepypasta website, but the story tradition predates that, and it sort of exists most actively now on 4chan and Reddit, where users can contribute freely and anonymously. And one of the rules for contribution on the subreddit No Sleep, which is a sort of creepypasta affiliated subreddit on the social media platform Reddit, users are given various rules for how to both how to contribute and how to receive stories. And one of these is the immersion rule, which is that everything is true even if it's not. So specifying that not only storytellers but also people replying to the stories assume a pretense of veracity and act as if the story is true. So that's been formalized now in creepypasta spaces. And what's interesting about this rule is that it's not really a rule, it's a quote unquote community guideline. And this sort of gestures towards another important folkloric element of creepypastas, which is a sort of collaborative world building. And the most famous example of that by far, and one which has been really well documented now by both folklorists and communication scholars, is Slenderman. You might be familiar with Slenderman. This is one of two of the original Slenderman photos posted by a user named Victor Surge on the website Something Awful in 2009, and he captioned it, one of two recovered photographs from the Stirling City Library blaze, notable for being taken on the day which 14 children vanished from what is known as the Slenderman. Deformities cited as film defects by officials, fire at library occurred 1 week later, actual photo confiscated as evidence. And then it says 1986, photographer Mary Thomas missing since June 13th, 1986. And if you haven't spotted Slenderman yet, he's over there underneath the tree on the left-hand side of the slide. The photo was posted as a response to a Photoshop challenge on the Something Awful thread, which sort of challenge users to create realistic paranormal photographs. And posters would show not just the end results of their photoshopping, but also their assets and their techniques. So for example, Victor Surge later shared that he used sort of assets from the movie Phantasm to create the Slenderman image. And Slenderman quickly took over the Photoshop challenge thread. Even users who didn't know how to Photoshop were able to find other ways to participate. So for instance, one user posted this photo of a farmhouse that was Photoshopped to include Slenderman. Again, you can see him there at the sort of bottom left-hand corner. And this user accompanied the photo with the caption, "Storytellers, you're more than welcome to write a backstory for this one." So a few hours later, somebody posted what was supposed to be a transcript of an interview between the farmer who had been committed to a mental hospital and his doctor. And then a few hours later, another user again posted an audio file wherein he and a friend performed a dramatization of the transcript. And as is typical of creepypastas, these were presented with a pretense of veracity, as if they had sort of somehow stumbled upon the recording. So even though the context of the Photoshop challenge makes it really obvious that these are fictional and these are creative pieces of media, they're still presented as true. That sort of aspect of veracity is still very much enshrined in the storytelling. And people even developed elaborate methodologies for belief in Slenderman, including the Tulpa theory, which sort of conceptualizes the Slenderman as a character who gains a physical presence in the real world through the belief and attention he's being paid online, sort of like a version of manifesting. And as the Slenderman spread really significantly, users collaboratively decided what elements were appropriate or inappropriate for the mythology. So early aspects of Slenderman that were less popular were minimized, such as the tentacles that he has in some of the early images, and then other aspects were developed, such as an element of stalking. People really responded to that, so that was developed. And you might be thinking, I thought I was going to a presentation on analog horror, not Slenderman. But analog horror developed from this very specific online storytelling culture, and the folkloric features of analog horror are sort of established in creepypastas and in Slenderman. And what we have here is a really collaborative form of storytelling, which demonstrates a sort of fluid tradition of repetition and variation, a free circulation of motifs between contributors. Users didn't feel the need to credit Victor Surge and any of these contributions. There was a real sense of collective ownership over the story, over the character. And because people didn't use their real names or photos or biographical details on the Something Awful platform, there's also a sense of anonymity or sort of somewhat anonymity in keeping with folklore's usual absence of named authors. And it's a mode of storytelling which invites accessible participation from the group, and that's central to its appeal, as this comment on the slide here from one user demonstrates. It's creepy, it's weird, and it makes me want to expand further on it. So what we have here is a tradition in which a tale is circulating within the group for free, for the benefit of the group, outside of institutions and official culture. And for all of these reasons, what we can call the Slenderman legend cycle meets a lot of the criteria of folklore. And then Slenderman went on to very directly influence the development of analog horror. So 10 days after Surge's original photographs, a user named Cigars shared a YouTube link on the thread to the first ever Marble Hornets video. And he posted in character as if he had sort of stumbled upon a sinister collection of videotapes. And Marble Hornets is a Slenderman web series which follows a character named Jay as he attempts to uncover the mystery of his friend's unfinished student film by deciphering this series of tapes which his friend has left behind. And it came to span 92 videos on a main channel, 38 accompanying videos on a side channel, and a Twitter profile. So it laid the groundwork for analog horror, establishing lots of features, including transmedial storytelling with the incorporation of the Twitter. Most importantly, a cryptic low fidelity found footage format, a minuscule budget, and sort of this taped aesthetic, most importantly of all, which incorporates glitching and media defects. And in the story world, the sort of proximity of Slenderman causes the technology to glitch, which really conveniently masks the low budget practical effects. So this was really sort of maybe the proto-analog horror, not perhaps the first true analog horror. There were several other proto-analog horrors in the following years, such as No Through Road in 2009 and Smile Guide in 2013, but it wasn't until 2015 that analog horror really took off. So it was the 26th of October, 2015, and Chris Straub uploaded a video to YouTube titled Weather Service. It's only 2 minutes and 38 seconds long, and it depicts late night television on a cable channel called Local 58 being interrupted by an emergency broadcast from the weather service about a dangerous meteorological event not to be looked at with the naked eye. And it says the warning is in effect until sunrise. Normal programming seems to resume temporarily, but then the warning returns and it's quickly hijacked, with the hijacker claiming that the danger is over and urging viewers to go outside and look at the sky. And there's a struggle then for control over the message, you can tell, with the first party now frantically warning viewers not to look at the moon, and the second voice trying to sort of sabotage that message. And ultimately, it seems that the hijacker is successful, and the video ends with sort of a series of mysterious messages from a speaker seemingly possessed maybe by the moon, including "The moon came in, I drown in him, and if you are afraid, we will look together." And the channel then really abruptly cuts to a live feed of the moon, of the event, with distant screaming available, and then it ends. And that was really the beginning of analog horror proper, as we can recognize it as a trend and as a subgenre. And expanded into a series of all different outputs from the cable channel Local 58, including things like corrupted weather reports, public service announcements, broadcast hijackings, children's TV shows, even one is a GPS, someone's GPS from their car dash cam. And the episodes are only really loosely connected. So a dedicated fandom emerged to sort of try and decipher the hidden plots through elaborate theorizing, both on YouTube and on those secondary spaces like Reddit and Discord. So the first season of Local 58 was hugely influential, and it inspired a big wave of sort of copycat productions, a lot of sort of broadcast-based analog horror. The most successful, perhaps, was CHSS by a user called Turkey Lennon III. So we don't know what the director's real name is. And that series presents as a series of messages from a mental health television service sponsored by the United States government. But as it progresses, a mysterious being disrupts these messages and sort of pursues its creators. And this is the screenshot of CHSS. And then in 2019, Remy Abode started publishing a terrifying addition to analog horror called Gemini Home Entertainment. This series is presented as a seemingly disconnected collection of VHS tapes from the distributor, Gemini Home Entertainments. So we have things like one is a nature documentary called World's Weirdest Animals, one is a PSA on storm safety, one is a demonstration of artificial computer intelligence from a computing company, and they all become progressively sinister as you get through the videos. And again, they're only loosely connected, and it's sort of up to the committed audience to decipher a hidden plot about an alien race and sort of a rogue, sentient, malicious planet which has it out for Earth. And that's a science fiction inflection in Gemini Home Entertainment that's also complemented with sort of Native American folklore of skinwalkers, which become wood crawlers in this diegetic world. So Gemini Home Entertainment was another massively influential contribution to the subgenre. Other series around this time include Eventide Media Center and the Walton Files, but the next big viral series was in 2021, and that was the Mandela Catalogue by Alex Kister. This revolves around a demonic race of doppelgangers or alternates in the world of the series who attempt to replace humanity, and they are led by Lucifer posing as the Archangel Gabriel. And the series is less technically complex than Local 58 or Gemini Home Entertainment, but it was extremely successful. It went very viral, and it sort of became what Dread Central called the supreme example of what analog horror looks and sounds like. So if you were going to satirize analog horror, you'd use the motifs of the Mandela Catalogue. And its accessible format inspired many copycat producers, which is something that creator Alex Kister encouraged, and he even posts sort of tutorials on how he created his frightening images. It's a genre that's continuing to flourish, with all of these series continuing to intermittently put out videos, and other successful series emerging, such as The Monument Mythos, Vita Carnus, Greylock, and then finally Kane Parsons' Backrooms, which is a series that expands on a piece of internet folklore about the Backrooms, a frighteningly expansive liminal office type space with no seeming way in or out. The first episode of Backrooms is presented as found footage as a young filmmaker accidentally teleports to this space and is pursued by a strange monster. And subsequent episodes develop a story around a mysterious scientific company called Async, who seek to research and exploit the Backrooms for capital gain. And some of the episodes are presented as found footage, some as video content such as training guidelines or safety messages for Async employees, but it's notable for how very viral it went. So the first episode has over 66 million views now, I think, and it's also notable because Alex Kister has been contracted to direct a feature film adaptation of the Backrooms for A24, which is just one of several times that analog horror has found its way into mainstream media. There's other sort of feature film adaptations such as Five Nights at Freddy's. You might be familiar with Skinamarink from a few years ago. And Backrooms also inspired the aesthetics of the popular TV show Severance. So here's a screenshot from one of the videotapes for employees. Never approach the threshold without guided supervision. Obviously, they do when it all goes wrong. And here's some of those mainstream adaptations of analog horror. You can kind of see how the aesthetics of Severance have been inspired by the Backrooms. So that's a very brief whistle-stop tour of the history of analog horror. I apologize for how fast that was. There's a lot to cover and get into, but hopefully you can see some of the consistent features emerging. The videos are all presented as true through the use of the found footage horror format, and that impression is exaggerated by their presence on the mundane, everyday spaces of social media. People can stumble upon them accidentally. The algorithm can suggest them to you. And they're also often very Lovecraftian. So even if we aren't dealing directly with an alien race, the spectator position in analog horror is one of sort of bewilderment in the face of something vast and sinister and sort of incomprehensible. And I really recommend these videos for that reason. If you haven't seen them, there's something really deeply and powerfully upsetting and unsettling about them. It's a really strong sense of insecurity that they sort of evoke in the viewer. And that's really exaggerated by their nostalgic format. Like I say, even if you haven't grown up with VHS aesthetics, there's a nostalgia built into the format, and it places you in a position of the child confronted with this adult world that's frightening for reasons you can't really understand. And for me, it sort of resonates both with the child audience of fairy tales as well as that sort of powerless Lovecraftian subject. Um, so I really recommend them if you haven't, and if you can watch them late at night on your own, even better. But let's look a little bit more at the folkloric elements of analog horror, which include fluidity, collaboration, repetition and variation, vernacularity, and a low barrier for entry. So I'll go through all of these with reference to some of the most prominent analog horror texts, the ones that I've mentioned already in this talk. So first of all, repetition and variation, that's a key idea in folklore studies. It sort of describes the way in which stories inevitably change over time, in order to survive, to make themselves relevant to new sort of cultural contexts and social needs. So for instance, there are hundreds of versions of the tale that we know as Cinderella. For instance, in China, the sort of downtrodden, hardworking girl is called Yi Xian, and she goes to the Lunar New Year festival instead of the ball. So stories are always changing in order to adapt to different cultural contexts like this. That's repetition and variation. And it's really relevant to oral storytelling because every time you retell a story by memory, it changes based on the preference of the storyteller and the audience and their memory, things like this. But it's also very relevant to analog horror, not least because it's so often based on creepypastas and it's so often adaptations of creepypastas in the first instance. So Local 58 developed from Chris Straub's own creepypasta Candle Cove, which is about a sinister children's television show that only children can see on a channel called Channel 58. And Marble Hornets came from Slenderman, as we've talked about already. But one of the best examples of this is actually Kane Parsons' Backrooms. So Parsons' versions of the Backrooms developed from an existing creepypasta called The Backrooms, which originated on 4chan in 2019, when an anonymous user, and most users on 4chan are anonymous, which is something very folkloric, as Jessica Balanza-Tegui has pointed out. This anonymous user started a thread on the paranormal themed board on 4chan, asking users to post disquieting images that just feel off, accompanied with a photograph of this eerily empty carpeted room with no windows. And then another user replied, also anonymous, supplying the first description of the Backrooms as well as giving it its name. And it says, If you're not careful and you no-clip out of reality in the wrong areas, you'll end up in the back rooms, where it's nothing but the stink of old moist carpet, the madness of Mara Yellow, the endless background noise of fluorescent lights at maximum hum buzz, and approximately 600 square miles of randomly segmented empty rooms to be trapped in. God save you if you hear something wandering around nearby, because it sure as hell has heard you. So that was the beginning of the backrooms. It's strongly affiliated with the liminal space aesthetic developed online. And they're usually portrayed as sort of a impossibly large extra-dimensional space. It became very popular on the creepypasta subreddit and eventually had its own subreddit of backrooms, where users, similar to with Slenderman, sort of collaboratively built on the world, expanded on the concept, adding details like different levels of the backrooms, which have different characteristics, and fleshing out hostile creatures that inhabit the space, which I believe are called entities in backrooms lore. So by the time Parsons made his version of the backrooms, it was an elaborately detailed variation on the creepypasta, created sort of painstakingly using photorealistic 3D animation and high quality voice acting and original scoring. And it was so successful that other users have expanded on Parsons' version of the backrooms, with copycat videos being so prominent that Parsons claims in an interview that the format has reached a saturation point. And here's some examples here of sort of copycat backrooms imitators. And you can see they even use the name async research in reference to Parsons' specific version of the backrooms. But he's sort of very gracious about it. He doesn't assert any authority over the story world, and he insists that all versions of the Backrooms tale type are valid. And he says in an interview they have the hazmat suits of his async researchers. They have the same characters as me. In a normal film setting, that would just be copyright infringement. That would be the theft of IP, intellectual property. But on the internet, everyone owns everything pretty much. I think everything is canon. He says, so this is a really clear example of fluidity and of the folk process of repetition and variation at work. And it applies really well to the internet, which is a space in which everything is canon. Analog horror is also vernacular, which is the concept used in folklore studies to describe sort of everyday, local, the ordinary. It's often used in reference to language and especially to architecture to sort of describe types of speech or building that are everyday, informal, and localized instead of being formal or institutional. So vernacular speech is like slang, and then sort of vernacular buildings would be built without architects depending on what resources were available. And the needs of the area. And analog horror is vernacular in two ways. The first is that it generates uncanny by drawing on very everyday objects such as the weather report, children's television, advertisements, and familiar everyday objects such as faces, mattresses in one series, your home, and the moon. So it sort of renders all of those things sinister. And the sort of formats of analog horror, which are supposed to be so mundane, are all the more disconcerting when they suddenly become threatening in analog horror. On another level, we also encounter analog horror on a very vernacular space of social media. Obviously, social media can be used for a massive range of things, but a large majority of people's engagement with social media is as a platform for the everyday. It sort of makes the practice of everyday life more visible, with users sending birthday wishes, posting baby photos, sharing a map of their daily jog, or this is a quote from Andrew Peck, live tweeting their reaction to the latest episode of The Bachelor. So social media is used by individuals displaying their movement through everyday life. So when an analog horror video comes up on your TikTok in between a video about holiday destinations or pasta recipes, it's very frightening, it's very unsettling. And it's very effective, but it's also very vernacular, a lot like Folklore. So, and here's some examples of analog horror on TikTok, some of which I think are really effective. You'll notice that the first screenshot there is from an Uncanny Valley makeup tutorial, sort of combining popular genre on TikTok for makeup tutorials with analog horror. And people will do these makeup tutorials and then give an example of their use in analog horror, which is really interesting. And I think the ability for these TikTok creators to contribute so effectively to analog horror really testifies to the low barrier of entry to analog horror. And in fact, Alex Kister created the first season of the Mandela Catalogue on his phone. Chris Straub created the first season of Local 58 on iMovie, which is the editing software that comes free with Apple products. And because analog horror is often made using stock footage and text to voice speech, it doesn't require any sort of cast or crew or budget, really. People can make analog horror quickly and relatively easily. And it means that analog horror often has an individual storyteller in a way that's much more similar to folklore than feature-length fiction film productions, in which the sort of creative responsibility for the film is distributed across director, producer, writer, actors, sound designers, everything like this. And it also means that analog horror producers can be very young. So Alex Kister was 17 when he started the Mandela Catalogue. Parsons was 16 when he started the Backrooms, when he became the Backrooms. And Turkey Lennon III was also 16 when he started CHSS. And interviewed anonymously for Alex Hira's YouTube documentary on analog horror, he attests, as a solo creator living without any friends who have the same interests, without any money. I was a kid, I was 16, no tech, I just used a computer the whole time. And I actually really recommend that analog horror documentary by Alex Hira on YouTube, The History of Analog Horror, if you would like a deeper dive into the history of the genre without all of my folklore theory getting in the way. If you're looking for more detail on analog horror, it's a really well-made documentary. But this sort of low barrier for entry is sort of exaggerated by the fact that producers of analog horror are very open with their methods and their techniques, in the same way as the sort of original posters on the Photoshop Slenderman thread on the Something Awful website, where people are very transparent about their methods. And major analog horror producers such as Kister and Straub and Parsons all actively contribute to fan spaces. They invite questions from their fans. They confirm or deny popular fan theories about the shows. And these are fan spaces that are very collaborative. Theorizing is sort of going on almost constantly, but people are also producing fan art, such as games, spin-off series, and they're sharing tutorials and advice on how to make these materials, how to use various editing softwares. Even when I was putting these slides together, I was able to really quickly find a thread on analog horror on Reddit that sort of describes the different fonts which are appropriate for different contexts and which ones have been overused and where to find them. So there's a really sort of open community. Information is circulating in a sort of informal, unofficial culture outside of institutional education for free and for the benefit of the group. So not to overstate the sort of democratic potentials of Reddit, but this is very folkloric. There's a collaborative group learning going on, in which the folk group uses the sort of collective information to support each other, and all of that is very folkloric as well. And a final folkloric trait to mention is the sort of participative nature of analog horror. So a lot of commercial feature films are sort of one-way streets in terms of participation, and this is sort of in opposition to the usual style of reception of folklore, in which the audience can have a very direct influence on the storytelling. Their reaction and their receptions can really influence the direction that a storyteller takes a particular tale in, which is something that doesn't often happen in mainstream horror cinema. But analog horror invites this kind of participation, and in fact, it kind of depends on it. So this is a screenshot from the Mandela Catalogue, and it's an episode in which uses a a children's Bible cartoon called The Beginner's Bible to depict sort of the birth of Jesus and the Archangel Gabriel, but it's actually Lucifer in disguise, has appeared to the Virgin Mary. And when he appears, his voice is distorted and his speech is unintelligible. But if you turn on the YouTube's closed captions, there is sort of binary hidden in the subtitles. And this is an open invitation for the audience to decipher the message, which they do in the comments section. And when translated, it reads, "I'm the one true savior. I must reverse the delusion. Joseph is next." So analog horror in this instance is actually relying on participation in order to effectively tell the story. It's counting on the fact that somebody will be motivated enough to interpret this binary code and share the message with everybody else. And this creates a very sort of collective viewing experience, which is ironic given the very literally individualized context in which you would normally receive analog horror on your own on YouTube. Here's another example. So this is from Local 58. This is a popular episode from the first season of Local 58 called Contingency, and it features an accidental broadcast of an alarming public service announcement from the American government. So Local 58 signs off for the evening and begins broadcasting color bars, and then suddenly this emergency broadcast appears from the Department for the Preservation of American Dignity, displaying a written message from President Lyndon B. Johnson set to the Star-Spangled Banner, and he warns that the American military has been overcome by an unforeseen threat and advises citizens to act. And this is act to preserve the memory of the United States, clear and bright. And this is revealed to be a call to suicide. And the broadcast instructs viewers to euthanize their children and pets first, adding that local law enforcement will ensure your compliance and that it is against the law to delay. So it concludes with the message then that the broadcast will repeat until there are none left to read it. And you can see from the screenshot here, again, we have a very uncanny use of nostalgia, both through the analog television aesthetic, and here's that aspect ratio, and the sort of distorted nationalist songs and imagery of flowers and the American flag and monuments and things like this. So abruptly, the broadcast disappears, and the Local 58 channel apologizes, claiming that the message was a hoax. But barely legible behind this is a second slide, instructing the station to make such a claim in the event that the video was accidentally broadcast too soon. So there's a call to participation inherent in this kind of hidden messaging that's common across analog horror, if not so directly with this kind of literally hidden messaging, then through really cryptic plots that need collaborative work to decipher. So to summarize then, do I have another slide? Yeah. Analog horror is variable, participatory. It's largely uncommodified, although there are some exceptions to that. And it's strongly rooted in the life of a niche that is local community. So it's folkloric through a free exchange of motifs, its location on social media, the vernacular space of social media, and its low barrier for entry. It can be produced for free, it's watched for free, and it is distinct, if not immune, from industrial official cultures. Obviously, it's still hosted on YouTube, which makes money, but the storytelling emerges from and circulates within a folk group of viewers whose traditions extend beyond mere reception to creative production, empowered by collective learning in a context where, to recall Parsons' words, everything is canon. So I would love to hear your thoughts on this, especially if we have any analog horror buffs in the audience. I think it's a really highly folkloric mode for me anyways, and I think there's a potential to consider it as at least closer to folklore than most mainstream versions of horror cinema, if not actually folklore. So thank you.